I never expected silence to feel this heavy, but it does when it follows a name you will never hear again. The words left my mind as I stood outside the chapel doors at my son Daniel's memorial service, my hands folded so tightly in front of me that I could feel every tremor I was trying to hide. People moved around me in slow, respectful clusters, offering condolences I could barely process, their voices blending into a distant hum that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. I am Margaret Collins. I am 68 years old, and I thought I understood grief until today made me realize I only understood its surface. The room inside was filled with soft light, white flowers, and the quiet weight of memories no one dared to speak aloud too loudly. My daughter-in-law, Rachel Collins, stood near the front with an expression that many would have called composed, even graceful, though something about it felt carefully placed rather than naturally worn. She greeted guests with the kind of polite sorrow that looked rehearsed, nodding at the right moments, touching arms lightly, thanking people as if she were hosting a gathering instead of standing at her husband's memorial. I told myself not to judge, not today, not in this moment, but grief makes you observant in ways you never asked for. I excused myself quietly, needing air, needing space from the density of emotion that seemed to press against my chest, and I walked down the narrow hallway beside the chapel, where the noise softened into echoes of footsteps and distant murmurs. That was when I heard her voice. At first, I thought I was mistaken, that maybe grief was playing tricks on me, but then I slowed down, because Rachel's voice has always had a certain clarity to it, a tone I could recognize even when I didn't want to. She was speaking just around the corner, not alone. There were others with her, a few friends I assumed from the sound of light laughter that didn't belong in a place like this. And then I heard it clearly, her words slipping through the air like something she hadn't intended me to catch. Now I can finally. She stopped there, followed by a small laugh from someone else, and my steps froze. I did not move forward. I did not interrupt. I did not announce my presence. I simply stood still, as if the world itself had asked me to pause before I understood something I was not yet meant to understand. My heart did not race in panic. It simply slowed, as if trying to listen more carefully than my ears could. I pressed myself slightly against the wall, not hiding, just existing in the space between truth and whatever came next. Rachel continued speaking, her tone softer now, almost relieved in a way I could not immediately name, and I felt something inside me shift, not loudly, not dramatically, but like a picture slightly tilting out of frame. I had come here to say goodbye to my son, but in that moment, I began to understand I might also be arriving at the beginning of something I had never been told existed. I did not move at first. I stayed close to the wall, listening to the sound of my own breathing as if it belonged to someone standing outside of their own life. Inside the chapel, the memorial service continued with quiet dignity, soft music drifting through the open doorway and the occasional murmur of voices offering comfort and sympathy. I should have gone back in immediately, I know that. A mother should not linger in hallways while her son is being remembered, but something in me had shifted, something I could not name yet, something that made even grief feel unfamiliar. I finally stepped away only when I heard footsteps approaching from the corner where Rachel had been speaking, and I forced myself to walk slowly, carefully, as if nothing had happened at all. When I returned to the main room, Rachel was exactly as I had left her, standing among guests with her hands gently folded, nodding at condolences, her expression calm and appropriately sorrowful. If I had not heard her voice only moments earlier, I would have believed her completely. That thought unsettled me more than I was willing to admit. The rest of the service passed in a blur of polite conversations, folded tissues, and quiet embraces. People spoke about Daniel as if his life could be summarized in a few gentle sentences, as if memories could be neatly arranged and closed. Like a book. I listened. I nodded. I accepted sympathy with a quiet thank you that felt distant from my own voice. Rachel remained near the front, speaking softly to guests, occasionally touching someone's arm in gratitude or acknowledgement, performing grief in a way that seemed almost practiced, though I told myself I was being unfair. After all, she had lost her husband as well. That fact alone should have anchored my thoughts, but instead it floated somewhere separate, disconnected from the unease I could not yet explain. When the formal part of the service ended, I found myself outside again, standing near the steps of the chapel where the air felt slightly cooler and less heavy. Cars were beginning to leave, engines starting quietly as people returned to their lives. I watched them go without moving, my mind replaying fragments of what I had heard in that hallway, especially those words that refused to resolve themselves into meaning. Now I can finally. I repeated them silently, turning them over like something fragile I did not want to break before understanding it. Rachel eventually joined a small group of people near the parking area, her posture relaxed in a way that felt almost too natural for the setting. She laughed softly at something someone said, a sound that made me pause again, though I told myself grief expresses itself differently for everyone. I have always believed that. I still want to believe that. But as I stood there watching her, I felt something else growing beneath that belief, something quieter and harder to dismiss. I decided not to approach her yet. Instead, I walked slowly toward my car, my steps steady but my thoughts uneven, as if the ground beneath them had become slightly unbalanced. Inside the car, I sat for a long moment without starting the engine, my hands resting on the steering wheel while I looked back at the chapel entrance. I tried to convince myself that I had misunderstood, that grief had simply sharpened my hearing and distorted innocent words into something they were not. But even as I thought it, I knew I was no longer certain of anything I had assumed about this day, or about the people I thought I knew. I remained in my car longer than I intended, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel while the engine stayed off. The parking lot outside the chapel was slowly emptying, one car at a time, people leaving behind a ceremony that still felt unfinished to me. I kept replaying the same fragment in my mind, not because I wanted to, but because it refused to fade. Now I can finally. Those words did not belong to grief. They did not belong to a widow or to someone mourning a husband. They sounded like release, like a burden being set down rather than carried. I told myself I was being unfair, that I was projecting confusion onto something I had not fully heard, but the doubt had already taken root. When I finally started the car, I did not drive home immediately. Instead, I found myself circling the neighborhood near the chapel, as if distance alone could organize my thoughts. Daniel's absence still felt unreal, like something my mind had not accepted as permanent yet, and yet the world around me was moving forward with an ease I could not match. Eventually, I drove back toward my home, a quiet house on a familiar street in suburban Ohio, the kind of place Daniel grew up running through as a child. The driveway was empty when I arrived. Rachel's car was not there yet, which I found strangely comforting and unsettling at the same time. Inside, the house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavier after a crowded room. I walked slowly through the living room, noticing small details I had overlooked in the morning rush, a folded blanket on the arm of the couch, a half-empty glass of water near the sink, traces of life continuing even while something significant had ended. I sat down in the chair near the window where Daniel used to sit during visits, and for the first time since the service began, I allowed myself to think about him without distraction. My son had always been steady, thoughtful, careful with his words, especially in recent years. There had been tension between him and Rachel at times, subtle disagreements that he tried to smooth over rather than confront. I had noticed it, but I had never asked too many questions, believing that marriages had their own private rhythm that outsiders should not interrupt. Now I found myself reconsidering that belief. A short while later, I heard the front door open. Rachel stepped inside, still wearing the same dark outfit from the service, her expression composed but slightly distant, as if she had not yet fully returned from the day herself. She paused when she saw me, offering a soft, polite smile that looked practiced in its gentleness. I watched her carefully, searching for something I could not yet define, but she simply set her purse down and asked if I wanted tea, her voice steady and normal. For a moment, I almost believed I had imagined everything in the hallway. Almost. I told her no, thank you, and she nodded, moving toward the kitchen with familiar ease, as if nothing unusual had ever occurred between us or within this house. I remained seated, observing her movements, noticing how quickly she returned to routine, how naturally she filled silence with ordinary gestures. When she asked me a simple question about whether I had eaten, I answered automatically, though my attention was elsewhere. My mind kept returning to that unfinished sentence, circling it like a shadow I could not step away from. As she stood at the counter, I realized something I had not considered before. Rachel was not behaving like someone who had just lost her husband. She was behaving like someone who had already moved past a threshold I had not yet crossed. And that realization, quiet and uninvited, stayed with me long after she left the room. I did not sleep that night in the way a person normally sleeps after a funeral. I lay in bed with the lights off, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet sounds of a house that still felt like it was waiting for someone who would never come back. Daniel's absence had always been an idea during the service, something contained within a ceremony, but now it was inside my home, inside the walls, inside every silence between rooms. Rachel had gone upstairs early, saying she was tired, her voice calm and even, as if exhaustion was the only thing weighing on her. I should have accepted that explanation without question, but my mind no longer accepted simple answers. I kept returning to the hallway at the chapel, to the fragment of her voice that refused to resolve into anything comforting. Morning came slowly, gray lights slipping through the curtains, and I rose before sunrise without realizing I had made the decision to do so. The house was still quiet. I moved through it slowly, as if I might disturb something fragile. On the kitchen counter, I found Rachel's cup from the night before, rinsed but not fully put away, a small detail that should have meant nothing but instead felt like a reminder that life continues even when meaning is unsettled. I made coffee, I did not finish, and sat at the table where Daniel used to sit during holidays, trying to organize my thoughts into something rational. I told myself I was grieving, that grief distorts perception, that it makes the mind search for patterns where there are none. But even as I thought it, I knew that explanation did not fully fit what I had heard. Later that morning, Rachel came downstairs dressed neatly, her hair pulled back, her expression composed in a way that looked almost identical to the day before. She asked if I had slept at all, her tone polite, careful. I said I had rested enough, though it was not entirely true. She poured herself coffee and sat across from me, and for a few minutes we spoke about simple things, the kind of conversation that avoids any depth that might create discomfort. I watched her closely while pretending not to, noticing how easily she moved through the space, how unaffected she appeared by the weight of the previous day. At one point she mentioned she needed to handle some calls related to arrangements, and I nodded without responding, but my attention was elsewhere. I was remembering Daniel again, not the version of him from childhood, but the man he had become in the last years of his life, more reserved, more thoughtful, sometimes distant in ways he tried to hide from me. I had assumed it was work, stress, the natural distance that comes with adulthood. Now I wondered if I had been wrong to accept that so easily. After Rachel left the room, I remained at the table, my hands resting around the cup. Without drinking, I thought about what I had seen and what I had not seen, about how easily someone can stand in front of you and appear unchanged even when something underneath has shifted. The more I replayed the fragment of her words, the more it felt less like confusion and more like intention, though I still could not yet understand what that intention was. I told myself I would not confront anything without certainty, that I would not let grief turn into suspicion without reason. But even as I made that promise silently to myself, I realized I had already begun to look at everything differently, as if the surface of my life had developed cracks I had never noticed before. I noticed the shift before I fully understood it. It was not a sound or a movement, but a pattern emerging in how Rachel spoke about the days ahead. That morning, she mentioned needing to meet someone about paperwork related to Daniel's affairs, and the way she said it felt practiced, as if she had repeated those words before in a different order, in a different room, to a different listener. I watched her from across the kitchen table while she scrolled through her phone, her thumb moving with quiet efficiency, and I found myself focusing less on what she was doing and more on what she was not doing. There was no hesitation in her actions, no visible disruption in her routine, no lingering weight in her expression that matched what I expected from someone who had just lost a husband. Instead, there was something structured, something organized beneath her calm that I could not ignore anymore. After she left the house that morning, saying she needed to take care of a few matters downtown, I remained where I was for a long time without moving. The house felt larger in her absence, not because it was empty, but because I could finally hear its silence without distraction. I began walking slowly through the hallway toward Daniel's study, a room he had kept neatly arranged even in moments of stress. Nothing had been touched since the service, but I found myself looking at everything differently, as if familiar objects had started to hold new meaning. On his desk sat a stack of papers I had seen before, but never paid close attention to, and for the first time, I felt an urge to understand them rather than simply accept their presence. I did not open anything immediately. Instead, I sat in his chair, the same chair he used when he called me on Sundays, and I tried to remember the last real conversation we had before everything changed. His voice had been steady, but there had been something underneath it that I had dismissed at the time, something careful, as if he was choosing words more deliberately than usual. I told myself I might be imagining connections that did not exist, but even that thought felt less certain than it once would have. Later, while I was still in the study, I heard the front door open again. Rachel had returned earlier than expected. I closed my eyes briefly before standing, telling myself I needed to remain calm, that nothing had been confirmed, that I was still only observing. When I walked back into the main room, she was placing her keys on the table, her expression unchanged, but her eyes paused slightly when she saw me, as if she had not expected me to be there. She asked if everything was all right, her tone light, and I answered that it was, though I could feel my own voice sounding more distant than usual. She nodded and moved toward the stairs, mentioning she had a few calls to make, and I watched her go without speaking. Only when she disappeared upstairs did I return to the study, sitting again in Daniel's chair, realizing that what had begun as a moment of confusion was slowly becoming something I could no longer explain away as grief alone. I stayed in Daniel's study longer than I intended, sitting in his chair as if remaining still could somehow help me understand what I was beginning to feel. The room had always been his quiet space, filled with ordered stacks of papers, a laptop he rarely left open for long, and small reminders of work that he never fully brought home. But now every object felt slightly out of place, not because anything had changed physically, but because I was seeing it through a different awareness, one that had begun forming only hours ago at the chapel. I leaned forward and finally opened the top folder on his desk. Inside were documents I did not immediately recognize, financial statements, property notes, and printed emails with sections highlighted in his careful handwriting. My eyes moved slowly across the pages, not because they were difficult to read, but because I was trying to understand why he had felt the need to mark certain lines. One phrase repeated in different forms caught my attention more than once, references to reviewing ownership structures and confirming beneficiary alignment. I did not fully understand the legal meaning, but I understood enough to feel a quiet tightening in my chest. I closed the folder and sat back again, telling myself I should stop, that I was crossing into something I was not prepared to interpret alone. That was when I heard footsteps upstairs, followed by the soft vibration of a phone ringing. Rachel's voice came faintly through the floorboards, partially muffled, but still clear enough to recognize. She was speaking in a calm tone, but there was a precision to her words that made me pause and listen without intending to. I could not hear everything, only fragments, mentions of timing, confirmation, and something about final arrangements. My name was not spoken, but I felt my awareness sharpen in a way that made the air in the room feel heavier. I remained still, listening until the call ended and silence returned. A few moments later, Rachel came down the stairs again, her footsteps measured, her presence as composed as before. When she entered the study doorway and saw me inside, there was a brief pause, shorter than a second, but noticeable enough that I registered it. She asked what I was doing, her tone gentle but slightly more controlled than earlier. I looked at the open folder on the desk and then back at her, choosing my words carefully. I said I was just trying to organize some of Daniel's things. She nodded slowly, her expression softening in a way that might have been reassurance or might have been something else entirely, and she stepped into the room without hesitation. She glanced briefly at the documents, but did not react strongly, instead suggesting that it might be better to leave. Everything as it is for now until everything is properly handled. The phrase stayed with me longer than it should have. I agreed quietly, though I did not fully mean it, and she left the room shortly after, saying she had another call to make. When she was gone, I closed the folder again, but I did not return it to its original place. Instead, I sat there holding it on my lap, realizing that I was no longer simply observing patterns. I was beginning to recognize that there were details in Daniel's life I had never been invited to see, And now, in his absence, those details were slowly beginning to surface in ways I could not ignore. I could not shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted, not outside of me, but within the way I was beginning to interpret everything around me. After Rachel left the study that afternoon, I remained alone for a long time, holding the closed folder in my lap without reading anything further, as if simply keeping it close might anchor me to something stable. The house was quiet again, but it was no longer the same kind of quiet I had felt after the memorial service. This quiet felt expectant, as if it was waiting for me to notice something I had been overlooking for too long. I eventually stood up and returned the documents to Daniel's desk exactly as I had found them, though my hands lingered slightly longer than necessary on the edge of the wood surface. I told myself I would stop searching, that I was allowing grief to distort my perception, but even as I made that promise, I knew I was already crossing a boundary I could not easily return from. That evening, Rachel mentioned she would be out for dinner with a colleague who had helped coordinate arrangements after Daniel's passing. Her tone was casual, almost routine, and I responded with simple acknowledgement, though I found myself watching her more closely than I intended. She left around 6:30 in the evening, dressed neatly, her demeanor unchanged from earlier in the day, and I stood by the window as her car pulled out of the driveway. Only when she disappeared down the street did I allow myself to move away. I did not sit down immediately. Instead, I walked through the house again, slower this time, noticing details I had previously dismissed. A calendar on the refrigerator had markings I had not paid attention to before, dates circled in faint ink that I did not recognize. A stack of mail on the kitchen counter contained envelopes addressed to both Daniel and Rachel, but some had already been opened and neatly resealed. I told myself there could be simple explanations, but each observation added to a growing sense that I was no longer seeing the full picture of the life my son had been living. Later that night, I returned to Daniel's study once more. The room was darker now, lit only by the soft glow of a desk lamp I had turned on earlier and forgotten to switch off. I sat in the same chair again, but this time I did not open any folders. Instead, I focused on the quiet, listening to the stillness of the house as if it might reveal something I had missed. At one point, I thought I heard Rachel return earlier than expected, the sound of her keys at the front door followed by faint movement in the hallway. I remained where I was, not making any sound, watching the doorway without stepping into view. She passed by the study without entering, her footsteps steady, her presence briefly filling the corridor before moving upstairs. I did not call out to her. I did not ask where she had been or what time she had returned. Instead, I waited until I could no longer hear her movements, and only then did I exhale slowly, realizing that my silence had become something intentional rather than passive. I looked down at my hands resting on the arm of the chair and understood that I was no longer simply reacting to grief. I was beginning to observe patterns I could not yet fully explain, and for the first time since the memorial service, I allowed myself to accept that there might be truths in this house I had never been meant to see so clearly. I did not realize how long I had been sitting in Daniel's study until the house shifted into the quieter rhythm of late evening, when every sound outside the windows felt more distant and deliberate. The desk lamp cast a soft circle of light over the surface where I had been sitting, and for a moment I simply watched the empty chair across from me, as if Daniel might still walk in and explain everything I could not yet understand. I told myself again that I was only grieving, that grief often creates patterns from absence, but that explanation was beginning to feel less convincing with each passing hour. It was close to 8 in the evening when I heard the front door open. This time, I did not mistake it for routine movement. There was a different quality to the sound, followed by the distinct pause of someone who had not expected silence to greet them so completely. I stood slowly, staying inside the study, and listened as footsteps moved across the foyer. Rachel called out my name once, her voice steady but slightly more cautious than usual, asking if I was still awake. I answered from the study without moving, and after a brief pause she appeared in the doorway, her expression composed but with a faint tension around her eyes that I had not noticed before. She asked if everything was all right again, and I said yes, though my voice felt distant even to me. For a moment, she did not leave. Instead, she looked past me into the study, toward Daniel's desk, as if assessing whether anything had been disturbed. Then she stepped inside, closing the door gently behind her, and said there was someone who wanted to speak with me, someone who had handled Daniel's arrangements from the beginning. I felt a small tightening in my chest at those words, though I kept my expression calm. A short while later, the doorbell rang, and Rachel went to answer it before I could respond. When I finally followed her into the living room, I saw a man standing near the entrance, dressed in a dark suit, holding a leather folder under one arm. Rachel introduced him briefly as Mr. Harrison, the family attorney. He greeted me with polite formality, his tone respectful but measured, and asked if I would sit down. I did so slowly, noticing how Rachel remained standing slightly behind him, her posture controlled but alert, as if she was preparing herself for something already in motion. Mr. Harrison opened the folder and began speaking about matters related to Daniel's estate, his words careful and precise, referencing documents, updates, and provisions that had been recently reviewed. As he spoke, I noticed Rachel's attention narrowing, her gaze fixed on the table between us rather than on me or the attorney. At one point, he paused and said something that made me lift my eyes fully toward him. He explained that there had been changes Daniel had initiated before his passing, changes that were intended to ensure clarity in certain financial and personal arrangements. He did not elaborate beyond that, but I noticed Rachel's hand tighten slightly around the edge of her sleeve. I asked a simple question, my voice quieter than I intended, and for the first time, Rachel responded before the attorney could, saying that everything had already been properly handled and that there was no need to revisit old matters. Her tone was calm, but there was a firmness beneath it that did not invite discussion. Mr. Harrison looked between us briefly, then closed the folder partway, stating that he would need to schedule a more formal review soon. When he left, the house felt heavier than before, as if his presence had shifted something that could not easily return to its previous place. Rachel remained in the living room after the door closed, standing still for several seconds before finally turning toward me. She asked if I was tired, suggesting I should rest, but I could hear something else underneath her words now, something carefully controlled rather than simply caring. I nodded without answering directly, and she left the room shortly after, walking upstairs again with the same measured steps. I remained seated, looking at the empty space where the attorney had stood, realizing that whatever had been unfolding in this house was no longer something I could dismiss as uncertainty or grief alone, and that Daniel's life, even after his passing, was still holding layers I had not yet been allowed to see. I remained in the living room long after the attorney left, sitting in silence that felt different from all the silences that had come before it. This one was no longer uncertain or accidental. It felt structured, as if every conversation that had taken place in my home over the past days was part of something carefully arranged just beyond my understanding. The folder Mr. Harrison had brought was still fresh in my mind, especially the way he had spoken about Daniel making changes before his passing. He had not given details, but the weight of his words had been enough to leave a mark that would not fade easily. I looked around the room slowly, noticing how ordinary everything still appeared. The couch where Rachel had sat earlier, the table where she had insisted everything was handled, the faint sound of the house settling as night deepened outside. It all looked unchanged, yet nothing felt unchanged anymore. I thought again about Daniel, about the quiet seriousness he had carried in his final months, the way he sometimes paused mid-sentence as if deciding how much truth he could safely share. I had assumed it was stress or routine concern, but now those memories felt different, as if they were pieces of something I had not known I was supposed to assemble. Upstairs, I heard movement, soft and controlled, Rachel moving through her usual evening routine. I did not call out to her. Instead, I stayed where I was, listening to the house as if it might reveal something without being asked. My mind kept returning to that fragment I had heard at the chapel, the unfinished sentence that had started all of this, and for the first time I realized I had never once asked Rachel directly what she had meant. Not because I did not want answers, but because something in me had not yet been ready to hear them. A few minutes later, Rachel came back downstairs. She paused when she saw me still seated in the living room, and for a brief moment I noticed something unfamiliar in her expression, not concern, not confusion, but something closer to calculation that she quickly concealed. She asked again if I was all right, and I answered the same way I had before, though this time my voice felt steadier, more aware. She hesitated, then said that things would become clearer soon, that there were still details being finalized, and that I should not worry myself with matters that were already in motion. The way she said it was calm, almost reassuring, but it no longer reached me in the same way. I simply nodded. After a moment, she returned upstairs, and I listened until her footsteps faded completely. Only then did I stand and walk slowly toward Daniel's study one last time. I did not sit down. I did not open any folders. Instead, I stood at his desk and looked at the space where everything had begun to shift. And in that quiet moment, I finally understood that what I had been hearing in fragments was never meant to remain incomplete. It had only been waiting for me to reach the point where I could finally hear it in full.